Hello everybody, we're going to be talking today about Vilém Flusser's and Louis Beck's Vampyroteuthis Infernalis, and the title of the presentation is The Borders Between Humanity and Animality. So what I'll be doing today is simply going through the major themes of the text, hopefully fleshing out some of the most sort of important topics that feature prominently there, so that we can have a clear idea of what's going on in this rather crazy text. So I wanted to start just by asking a very general question, which is, what is really this text all about? It's a really strange text. What is its genre? How do we classify it? And the first thing we can say, obviously, is that this is not just one thing. It's a kind of experimental work, and it brings together all kinds of genres and disciplines and different modes of thinking. So to begin with, we can say that actually it is part of a scientific commentary or scientific investigation, which of course is about this one particular organism, the vampire squid. And it is not just one sort of like investigation or scientific account, but it attempts to bring together a variety of registers from science. Among them, I've discerned four of the most important ones. So it's partially a study of animal ethology, that is to say, the way organisms behave, the behavior of organisms. That's what ethology studies. But it is also a study of animal ecology, of course. It's part of a study of how it is that an organism relates to its environment and to other organisms. It's also a text or a partial study of animal psychology or parapsychology, and we'll say a few words about that, which is a study of the mental states and the processes of the mental processes that organisms engage with. Finally, we can say it's also partially a study of animal anatomy, which is a study of the bodily components and of the different systems that organize the structure of organisms as individuals. So it's a variety of Flusser and Beck draw from a variety of scientific studies and a variety of scientific, sort of approaches to this organism and its relationship to its environment. But beyond the scientific, quote-unquote, set of registers from which this text draws, it is obviously also a work of philosophy, of theory or speculation. And in doing so, it brings together a set of very broad-ranging questions, which ultimately are about the relationship between humans and the rest of nature. And in this regard, the text is not only supposed to be a sort of summary of scientific results or different scientific fields, but it draws very direct sort of speculative links to other fields of study, including the social sciences, sociology, for example, to politics, to psychoanalysis, to parapsychology and art. Parapsychology, long story short, is the branch of psychology that is outside of the academically reputable psychology, so like the crazy psychology. Psychology, the study of psychological processes that are not normally studied by, quote unquote, bona fide institutionalized psychology. Well, in any case, in this broad-ranging philosophical sense that brings together all these scientific and different, political, artistic, psychological, and everything else modes of thinking, I think there are two really large questions that Flusser and Beck tried to address that concern the relationship between humans and animals in general. And we're going to be looking at that relationship as it's fleshed out in the text. But these two questions are what I name in the slide here. First, the demarcation question, and the question is roughly this one. What makes humans unique in the order of nature? What is distinctive about us? And this is not only, of course, a scientific question which concerns the properties of our ecological, anatomical, ethological properties as animals that we are. Historically, it's also been woven into, for example, our understanding of ourselves as cultural beings, as rational beings, as beings perhaps that have a soul, that are somehow an exception to the rest of nature, right? The human has been accorded traditionally this exceptional status in relation to the rest of nature. So a question is that remains very much with us is, how do we understand ourselves, right? How do we differentiate or distinguish ourselves from the rest of nature? However, this leads us to the second question, which is, if in fact we are just animals, if we are just part of nature, if we belong to nature and we are not really an exception to nature, then in the wake of Darwinism, in the wake of evolution, which understands that humans are clever apes that evolved in natural history, then how do we fit in nature? In other words, how do we explain all these things that are unique about humans, thinking, language, culture, as we understand them, as continuous with and emerging from nature as already existent before the advent of humans and the advent of human cultures, languages, and so on. So we must both understand what's unique about us, but also how it is that we are continuous with the rest of nature. And of course, the text is going to propose an exploration of precisely the nature of humanity by placing it in contrast with the nature of the vampire squid. So a very brief word on the structure of the text. I'm sure we all picked this up, which is that the argument really in this chapter is broken down into three constitutive parts. And the three parts are thinking, sociality, and art. So in the first part, Flusser and Beck try to answer the question, how does the vampire squid think? What are its mental processes? And this overlaps, of course, partially with what we designated as animal psychology. In the second section, however, the authors interrogate the question of how does the vampire squid interact with others of its kind and with its environment in this kind of social and even political way. So there is a sociality that is already evinced in the vampire squid, and of course this also turns out to illuminate a great deal about human psychology and sociality. And finally, there is a question of art. Can the vampire squid be said to be engaged in a form of artistic production? And in fact, Flusser and Beck will say that it does, and the way that they propose to understand this artistry that is sort of carried out by the vampire squid is by trying to understand how it is that the vampire squid stores memory and transfers information and engages in a kind of production that is very much unlike that of the human, but at the same time there is a prediction concerning what the future of the human might be, where it comes to resemble more the vampire squid. So let us go through these three sort of episodes or stages in the argument. I will focus mostly on the first part because it sets the foundation for the second and third parts. So I will spend most of the remaining time speaking roughly about the structure of this first part, and then we'll move briefly and just comment on the second and third parts. So the first part, again, trying to interrogate the thinking processes of the vampire squid, trying to understand its psychological and communicational capabilities. The first thing that Flusser and Beck argue is that thinking in general cannot be understood to a simple anatomical study, say for example of processes going on in the brain of organisms with nervous systems, right? But already understanding thinking has to do with understanding how it is that the mental capacities of an organism occur in relationship to its environment, in relationship to the needs to communicate, to convey and capture information, to store information, and so on. So in this regard, thinking is understood already not only as a private affair, something that goes, let's say, inside your head or inside the head of the squid, but it's something that is an interface between an organism and its world and its environment. And the first thing that we're told already is that the vampire squid does think, it reflects, and it does so in analogy with the way we understand thinking to happen in humans, even though they are, of course, quite different. And part of what the part of this in the chapter tries to do is to clarify precisely the extent to which these capacities for thought overlap and do not overlap. So we're even told something stronger, in fact, that the vampire squid does not only think or reflect, but it actually has a kind of philosophy of its own, if you will. And here's the first quote that I'll read from the text. Its sensory organs, that of the vampire squid, transmit bits of information to its brain that are no less complex than those transmitted to ours. Its brain must therefore process this data with methods that are accordingly complex. It could not survive any less than we could without having control over these processes. If we momentarily leaving aside the soul to replace the term reflection with philosophizing, then we would have to concede that no less than we could, the Vampyroteuthis could not survive without philosophy. Now, of course, the question then becomes, how do we understand thinking in general, and how do we understand these philosophical capabilities of the vampire squid in analogy with those of humans? So, after this, the authors go on to offer a definition of reflection. And here's the definition right on top here. Reflection is the process through which reason allows the organism to theoretically interpret and practically manipulate sensory appearances, what they call also phenomena. It's a very classical philosophical concept. But the idea is actually rather simple, which is that reflection or thinking has to do with how it is that we, as it were, chop up the data that is given to us through our sensory mechanisms. We all perceive the world or see the world or sense the world through our different sensory organs, right? And different animals have different ways of, or different sensory modalities. And then thinking is the way in which this sensory information is chopped up or interpreted. And on the basis of this interpretation of sensory information, right, we are able to manipulate and to intervene upon the world to which we belong and that we perceive. So we perceive the world through the senses, we interpret it through reason, and it is through reason that we become able, therefore, to act upon the world and to change it, manipulate it, intervene upon it. Here's the second quote. Reflection is the process by which reason penetrates behind appearances in order to be able to think about them. Reflection is thus preliminary to thinking. The role of reason in this process is that of a scalpel. It dissects phenomena into discernible rations. This rationalizing allows us to look through phenomena, to look through gaps between the rations. This is theory, and it also allows us to manipulate these rations. This is praxis. So it's theory and praxis, right? We think about the world, we chop it up into little bits, and then on the basis of this interpretation, we act upon the world. So we interpret the world theoretically and we manipulate it practically, right? And essentially, something interesting is that Flusser says is that this process of interpretation involves producing a model of your environment. Concepts, rationally acquired concepts, allow us to produce a kind of model or a double or a representation of our worlds. So then, without these models, then the data of sensation would just be given to us, but we wouldn't interpret it. It would have no form. Just think about the ways in which the same sensory experience can be interpreted in many different ways by different perceivers. You can look at a glass of water and say, oh, this is a glass of water through the concepts glass and water, or you can think of it as a physical system bound by microphysical particles. Depending on the different conceptual frameworks, the different kinds of interventions and interpretations that you can look at the object as are very different. So then the question is, of course, does the vampire squid have concepts? Does it reason in this way? And Flusser says, yes, in fact, it does, but in a very different way than humans do. Not through language in the sense that we understand humans, and certainly not through scientific cognition in the sense of doing theories or anything like that. And what's unique really about this rational and conceptual capabilities of the vampire squid is that they are in origin integrated into a sexual dynamics. Dynamics, of course, of reproductive aim and success. And this originary sexual nature of the vampire squid's rational capabilities is what makes it, Flusser will argue, psychoanalytic in its origin. This is kind of like a Freudian origin. Here's the quote. Its chromatophores emit cones of light that delineate the darkness into rations before they are conceived. Its reason is therefore preconceptual. It perceives things rationally in order to comprehend them, only to comprehend what this light reason has already rationalized. Since its tentacles are equipped with sexual organs, the concepts that it abstracts from these illuminated cones of reason, pure reason as we would say, are sexually laden. There are male and female concepts. When the male rationally illuminates a female to comprehend its abdomen, and when the female responds by rationally illuminating the male to comprehend its penis, what occurs is the masculine comprehension of feminine concepts and the feminine comprehension of masculine concepts. So what the authors are saying here, is that we understand the way in which the vampire squid thinks in relationship to its reproductive sort of act, and in this act of reproduction, the squid forms a simulation of its environment whose concepts are constitutively gendered. They're male and female. They are, in other words, the vampire squid models and simulates its world. It interprets its world in gender terms. So it's a very strange, sort of theory, if you will, and this rooting in sexuality allows Flusser to draw an analogy with human cognition and human sexuality. Because according to Flusser and Beck, what is unique about human sexuality in relation to the vampire squid is that it is not based originally on sexuality as the vampire squid's is. And in fact, human conceptualization has been historically, since its origin, a history of repressing the sexual. And in fact, specifically rooted in a fear of what they call female rebellion. There is a kind of sort of repression of the female or the feminine, whereas in the case of the vampire squid, as the origins of conceptualization are already gendered in nature, consecrated or consummated in the act of copulation. And then they rehearse how it is that they engage in this sort of communication of information and transmission and forming of concepts through these glandular sort of modules that they are endowed with. And this leads them to sort of list, the authors, a list of the different parts that the vampire squid has. I won't read this just for time's sake. So this leads us to the second part of the essay, right, which is already to understand that the vampire squid is rational, it thinks, it has concepts, its concepts are gendered and sexual, and they will say they are actually social creatures. Indeed, they are political creatures. And the first thing that they will say here in the second part is that evolution, the history of natural evolution, which is of course a history of how it is that natural selection guides the quote-unquote generational transmission of genetic information and the selection of species and the survival of species, has already intrinsically a tendency towards socialization. And that this tendency towards socialization can be seen from the microorganic, from the cellular level, all the way to the level of organisms and how they organize each other. They focus on this concept of what they called super societies, which is really the concept of a superorganism. So animals, individual organisms, develop into superorganisms insofar as they enter into a kind of network of relationships in which they let go or they relinquish their own singular individuality, and they assume a role that's only intelligible and beneficial in relationship to the other members of the community or the society. The example is, of course, ants, right? Exoskeletical creatures like insects, right, have a real hard pressure, evolutionary pressure, which is that they cannot grow because, Flusser and Beck argue, if they grew past a certain threshold of size, they would actually crumble because of their own size. They compensate for this deficiency by evolving into superorganisms, into these kinds of like societies in which all of the individual parts constitute a colony or an actual unit. So a superorganism is composed of individual organisms, and they function as a functional unity that cannot be reduced to the individual parts that are made up of. So you understand what the ants do in terms of like the collection of things that they do as a unit, as opposed to what each individual ant does. But the vampire squid, in this regard, is more like us, which is not a superorganism in the sense that it functions in this unified way, but they're highly individual organisms, and they live in poorly organized societies. And in fact, this leads the authors to describe how it is that the vampire squid prioritizes fraternity over equality, and that they have a politics, but their politics is one of anarchic fraternal strife. They live in a kind of state of competition with their own brethren, right? They produce twins, but they want to hunt each other, and they're engaged in this cannibalistic sort of politics or anarchic state. A movement of hatred that deviates from love. Whereas, in contrast, we humans begin in a state of war, and we produce societies that tend towards socialization. It's a kind of weird inversion here, but we're moving kind of fast. Finally, just a few words on art. I don't want to go for too long here, but we get to this final step in the argument in which this social and ecological sort of transmission of information that defines how the vampire squid interacts with its environment and with others of its kind also makes it part of makes it belong to a kind of historical being, a kind of historical process in which we can have something analogous to art, or basically a kind of art that's very different from humans. Whereas these kind of basic processes of natural selection that guide evolution are, of course, transmissions of genetic information that is completely blind, involuntary, right? They are based on precisely, blind mechanisms. Flusser and Beck describe these super biological processes of informational transmission and storage, which is what art is, in which information is deliberately manipulated and transformed. And this is super biological because it goes beyond the mechanisms of natural evolution. This is a kind of cultural memory, if you will. So we have then a definition of art, which is a method for fabricating artificial memories, right? And we are told here that human art is, or has been, traditionally object-based or object-bound. And what the authors mean here is that we basically externalize memory by projecting it onto objects, buildings, technological apparatuses, and so on. But the authors argue these objects are fickle. They perish in time by the laws of entropy themselves, right? Whereas, on the other hand, the vampire squid has a kind of different mode of artistic production that once again takes us back to sexuality. And the way it does so is by basically creating this, again, sexual interface of seduction that begins when the vampire squid perceives something new in its environment. So the vampire squid perceives something new in its environment. It has to update its memory models. It then secretes this mist of colors, which works in turn to attract the other squid. And then, of course, through copulation, there is this transmission of the new memory or the new information. Now, the authors don't go in detail about how this actually happens, but basically, it's supposed to happen somehow through the act of copulation. So there's, again, this relationship between the orgasm and the copulation between the species, the sexual nature of the sexual relationship, in fact, and the transmission of information and even artistic production. And here's the last quote I'll read. Artistic creation is therefore both an outdated expression by an artist and an inward impression upon the seduced. It is an act of raping another Vampyroteuthis in an effort to become immortal in the body of the victim. Its art is a mode of rape and hatred of deception, fiction, lies. It is delusive affectation, that is to say, it is beauty. It is, all of this, oddly enough, in the spirit of orgasm. And what's kind of interesting is, of course, we also see this in the second part when they're talking about how it is that the vampire squid's social sort of interactions are based fundamentally on this kind of anarchic, competitive, predatorial sort of tendency that is based upon deception and lying, whereas human cultures and traditionally are conceived as pursuing truth or something of the sort. But what we finally get at the very end of the essay is a suggestion that maybe the future of human art actually comes to resemble more that of the vampire squid, specifically in the wake of the informatic age, or the age of information, where the human artistic production and technological production becomes unbound from material objects, from buildings and things that perish in time, and enter this virtual, immaterial domain of symbolic communication. And presumably, this kind of virtual space of informational transmission is a kind of odd development in human history that brings us closer to the vampire squid in its modes of art production and its forms of eroticism, then also by extension. Well, anyway, those are the basic ideas that I think the text touches upon. Hopefully, the PowerPoint and the slides help you clarify a few of these concepts. I'm already way over what I agreed to submit, but thank you all, and hopefully you enjoy this. Bye-bye.